I did more than I ever thought I could do in my life. I lived in a tenement in Brooklyn, a roach-infested tenement. My father was a garbage man. I was at the bottom of the socioeconomic ladder. My parents were really poor. I would not give anybody in similar circumstances that advice, to follow your dream, you know. I mean, I would not go down to East LA and tell the kids there to follow their dream. Just, go try to find a way to make a living. Got to Hollywood 12 years ago, and I was working on the Real D system. I'd go to the studios and people would have me sign one of the books I wrote. So I'd go to Disney and somebody would have a copy of independent filmmaking. I would sign it for him. So I go back to Disney on another day, and some vice president would say, "Here's Lenny Lipton. He wrote Puff the Magic Dragon." Everybody would clap. So I'd go back another day, and I'd be, helping them set up a 3D projector. Puff gave me a lot of freedom because the royalties kept me going for years. I did years of lab work. I didn't have to get a job, so I worked in my little studio in Point Richmond for years, developing my stereoscopic inventions, until I reached the point where Puff royalties couldn't fund what I was doing anymore. And so I needed to raise money. And right away, I raised a lot of money. And then it took years to turn what I was doing into products. I had a product called Crystallize. Crystallize did very, very well. It's a very high margin, most excellent product. It was used by people in scientific visualization. It had a really good run for its money for 15 years. And I also, with the help of Jim Ferguson and Art Berman and Larry Meyer and Bruce Dorworth, we perfected the projection Z-screen. That's in 30,000 cinemas. We made an electro-optical device that you could put on a projector. You could project a 3D movie and look at it with polarizing glasses. And it was good. It was very good quality. But the theatrical cinema wasn't ready for it until about 2004, 2005. But then the studios had a very strong motive to reduce their print cost and also hopefully curtail piracy. They did reduce their print costs because digital distribution is very inexpensive. When I was a kid, time I was about 11 or 12, there was a 3D boom. People were making 3D movies for a period of about 18 months. House of Wax, Born a Devil, and just things like Kiss Me Kate, Dial M for Murder, Hondo. I saw many of them in 3D, and I lived in New York City, so I could see a pretty good projection. It didn't last long, but it really made a very deep impression. And although I cannot explain it, I felt like this was mine. I don't know how to explain it. It was just mine. I knew this was part of I had a very deep interest in stereoscopic images, stereoscopic cinema. I thought it was just beautiful. And I thought there was something extra. See, the movies in the 53 and 54, they weren't effects driven. Today, the stereoscopic cinema is entirely visual effects driven. But in the 50s, you had the usual mix of movies. It was really driven by stories and actors. And I was very impressed at how wonderful this kind of cinema was. It was just different. Looking at the actors and what they were doing, it was like I was there with them. And I believe that's the strength of the stereoscopic cinema. But I don't know how long it'll take before Hollywood discovers it, because it's being used in the most obvious way. They found a way to make money with it, and I don't blame them. But I think people would like to see other kinds of movies stereoscopically too, although it's a hard sell. It sounds like it's a crazy idea, but people aren't about to make them because they're going to make superhero movies in 3D. I lived in El Cerrito in like 1969 or something like that, and it was the rain that really put it over. If it had been a nice winter, I don't think I would have written that much. And it took a lot of chutzpah to write something like that, because, what did I know? I had just maybe 5 years of experience as an independent filmmaker, but I was, kind of a technical maven. I knew a lot about 16 millimeter. I knew a lot of filmmakers like me. They used to be called underground filmmakers. Sometimes they were called independent filmmakers, but today independent filmmakers are people who take their features to Sundance. So these people were making really eccentric movies, and I was friends with them, and my point of view was a film, 16 millimeter mostly, as a medium of self-expression. So I wrote this book that I thought would have been a good book, that if I had starting out, it would have been very helpful. And it was in print for 20 years. It was quite amazing. The funny thing is about film technology, you could write a book about photochemical celluloid cinema. It would stay perfectly fine for decades. You can't do that now with the electronic or the digital cinema. I don't think you can do it. It's too rapid a change. And my technology involved projection. And people were able to put together camera systems that would work under a number of circumstances. So in terms of although I am an expert on the cinematography part of it, I didn't get involved in that portion of it in terms of the Hollywood cinema. So my efforts for years were in developing good projection systems. If you do a CG animated cartoon, stuff from Pixar or Blue Sky, you immediately have the ability to produce very good stereoscopic images. It's just built into the software. In terms of the so-called live action theatrical cinema, which is to a significant extent CG cartoons, like a film like Avatar, which is, most of the film is a CG cartoon. I had a different dream. I can't control the way people have used the medium. I had hoped that the stereoscopic cinema would be about actors and acting and involve people in stories about the human condition. But that's not what's happened. What's happened is it's a cinema of spectacle. And it's not the fault of the stereoscopic medium, because the cinema has been going in the direction of spectacle without any help from me for a long time. As soon as somebody has a success, a financial success with a stereoscopic documentary or a stereoscopic buddy comedy, then the studios will copy it, but that hasn't happened. Cinema has two components that I think most people would agree on. It's got to project, it's got to move. And when Huygens invented the projector in 1659, it did. It projected on walls, and you could make images move by various means. Like, for example, when you put a slide in a slide projector and you look at the screen, the slide moves. So let's make a long slide. So the pan was invented in the 17th century. You had a long slide with a long scene. You pushed it through the projector. That was a pan. The dissolve was invented before the celluloid cinema. And so is basic animation, in which you've got cell animation. You've got a foreground and a background. Pans, tilts, dissolves, cuts. They were all invented before Edison made his camera. And it went on for a long time. So it's very, very interesting. And as the technology has changed, for example, the carrier of information for 250 years was glass. There's only so much you can do with a glass substrate. As soon as you get into celluloid, you really can move from a cinema of real motion, in which you're really moving a slide, to the cinema of apparent motion, in which you have a number of similar frames that are rapidly changed, which is very, very flexible. Then you can show any kind of motion. And that changed cinema. And then you get to the new kind of information carrier, the digital cinema, that leads to more changes. So the technology does change how the filmmakers, what the filmmakers will be able to say. I think human beings thinking about who they are and how they act with each other and with the world they live in is very, very important. It's very important for us to introspect and think about it. And it's also entertaining if it's done right. And the cinema of humanity, not of freaks in costumes, is what I had hoped. I had hoped that the stereoscopic cinema would be used to explore the human condition. And I don't mean it in a way that everything's got to be serious. I mean, like, I remember in Kurosawa said that you make the most serious film that you want to make about. It could be, grim, depressing. If it's not entertaining, it's not worth it. So I'm not saying I don't want entertainment, but I'd like it to be something about other than Superman and Batman. I think people fall in love. Parents have problems with their kids. People have problems with their sexual identities. Well, stereoscopic cinema, it sounds odd, but when you look at actors in 3D, it's more interesting and more involving. I'm not alone in this. I mean, I'm echoing, Jim Cameron and Peter Jackson. But when I was 12 years old and I saw Miss Sadie Thompson, I would see any 3D movie. It was extremely engaging. I learned something, and I saw things in that movie. And maybe the stereoscopic cinema will get there sooner or later. I had hoped it would be used for other things. But, when I invented my stereoscopic display system, I had no idea that aerial mapping or molecular modeling were going to pay the bills. I didn't know.
I think it really comes down to what is your creative vision? How do you want to tell this story? And it doesn't matter if you have the cheapest camera you can find or if you have the most expensive one, if it's HD or if it's 24K, it doesn't matter. At the end of the day, you really need to understand what is the image that you want to get across, what is the story you want to tell, and how do you want to put it into pictures. The line definitely has blurred between TV and film. The interesting thing, it always used to be a fairly clear delineation between you're doing something in a theater and you're creating content for a theater, and then you do another trim pass essentially to create the content for the home. And these things have always been fairly separate, where the experience in a theater was always this prime experience with the best possible quality, and then you go to the home and you have to start making arrangements for a slightly different experience where you have a lot more ambient light, you have very unpredictable viewing conditions as opposed to going to a fairly dark, fairly well understood environment in a theater. For the last couple of years, especially with the emergence of these so-called next generation video technologies, that situation has changed a little bit to a point where a lot of it is now driven in terms of capabilities and experiences by what's possible in the home. Televisions, consumer electronics displays essentially have a lot more capabilities to what they used to have. Yet the theatrical environment hasn't really changed that much yet. I think it's starting to change. It's kind of like trickling back down into the theater environment, but at least at this point in time, arguably you can get a better experience in the home than you can potentially get in a theater environment. If you just look at the pure technical parameters, I think consumer displays in the home are already a lot more capable than what a lot of the theater projectors are capable of doing today. If you look at the light output, if you look at the potential dynamic range for some of these displays, especially the newer ones, not so much the older ones, you are able to do a lot better in home displays than you are in a theater environment. The difference, though, and the big caveat I would put in there, why I still believe that a theatrical environment is, a theatrical experience is superior, is that you have much more control over the actual viewing conditions. It is dark, you have a much larger screen. You usually go there even with a mindset where you sit down and you want to enjoy a movie, as opposed to at home where a lot of things just run on the TV, especially if it's TV shows, where it's not necessarily the primary reason for you to be there. A lot of times you do something else. There were a lot of these technologies at some point in time that were like around second screen. So it's really acknowledging the fact that you're sitting in the home, you're watching your television and you're doing something in parallel. Whereas if you go to a movie theater, you sit down, you watch the movie, you enjoy the movie, and you're still getting an incredibly good experience. We're arguably at a point where some manufacturers will keep pushing for more resolution. We've seen already that I think some Japanese broadcasters like NHK are pushing for 8K resolution. I'm not sure that pushing for more and more resolution is really going to significantly benefit the consumer. I think getting widespread adoption of these next-gen technologies, particularly HDR and wide color gamut, is something that we feel is very interesting for consumers. And I think that will be something that we will continue to see improvements in the display devices, being able to do more light output, being able to do better tone mapping. There's a number of challenges about just adding increased resolution and whether or not consumers will actually be able to perceive the difference between HD and UHD or HD and 4K. One of the other image improvements that we have been very excited about has been around higher dynamic range, wider color gamut, because consumers will be able to actually see that difference. When you have much more contrast and much more vibrant colors, that's something that a consumer can easily pick up, whereas the difference between the number of pixels that are on a screen is going to be very, very difficult for them to really perceive. From a content provider perspective, we're of course very interested in making sure that our content in the end, on the end devices, looks the way it was intended to be. And looking at a lot of those devices today, there's a lot of times lots of variability from one TV to another TV, and then you have all these different settings in a TV where your content looks significantly different. For us, that's very disappointing because we really just wanted to look the way it was intended and the way the creator had it in mind. So we will continue to push for being able to get more standards around that, being able to get the signals and the content that we're creating all the way down into the home for consumers to enjoy the way it was intended to be. I think most of the discussions in the standards community at large are really about how do you manage those workflows. There's different proposals, there's different ways for implementing these next-gen video features, whether that's 4K or 8K or high dynamic range. But I'm not sure that I want to go into the details of those. But I think a lot of the issues are around how do you create different formats, how do you send them down to a consumer, and how is it getting processed. And as you can probably imagine, there's number of different ways to essentially achieve the same thing. And then a lot of the questions really come down to what is the best way to do that. And if you can imagine, you're shooting a scene at the inside and you have a window and suddenly you're also able to see what's happening outside at the same time. You don't have to make these creative decisions anymore, but it does change the workflow, it does change the production design. But the more our creative producers learn about that, the more they are excited about it. There's two different things that we need to look at. One is having the capabilities, and the other one, if a creative wants to take advantage of them. Our job at the studio and the technology group is to really provide all the tools to our creatives so that they can essentially take advantage of them to enhance their storytelling. A lot of our creatives like those capabilities, especially around higher dynamic range, being able to show more detail in the dark areas and in the bright highlights at the same time is something that they can really enhance their storytelling. If it does help them enhance their story, if it does help them create their vision, then absolutely they want to use it. And it's our job to make sure that they have the tools available if they choose to do so. Light field photography, it's something that I personally find very interesting. The more the creatives learn about these technologies and about these capabilities, the more they start thinking about it differently. We've had some discussions with, for instance, directors of photography, camera people, directors, and so on. And the more you start talking to them about it, and the more they understand the capabilities that these technologies provide to them, they immediately start thinking about and put it together for their projects of, oh, what do I need to change in the production design? How I can take advantage? How can I make the picture look better? How can I make it help tell the story in a different way? How do I design a shot differently? So I think a lot of these things will change the storytelling potentially and will change in how they design shots and how they go about telling their story. I think those people really need to understand the technologies because they're the ones designing the shots. There's always the saying, we can fix it in post, but I think the more you take these capabilities into consideration at the outset, the more capabilities you have at the end. You can always try to fix something in post, but that shouldn't be the primary goal. The goal should be to create your shot and make your image acquisition based on what your creative vision is. But the capability of being able to shoot a scene and having full control afterwards over what type of lensing you virtually want to put in front of, what is the depth of field that you would like to see in the scene, where do you want to do the blurring, and so on and so forth. How do you change the lighting after the fact? All of these things are incredibly revolutionary. I think we're really just at the very beginning of all of this. And it's going to be interesting to figure out how it really develops over time and how creatives are starting to take advantage of that, because it does change the production process quite a bit, because they don't have to make these decisions in the beginning anymore. They can potentially do it after the fact, but is that always better? Is it going to slow down the whole process because you have so many more opportunities where once your shot is over, you have what you have in the can, and that's what you need to work with. Whereas if you go with light field, you have all these possibilities afterwards. So I find it very interesting from a technical perspective, because it allows you essentially you're recording a 3D model of the scene, and it gives you lots of flexibility after the fact.